And then after I went on this tour with Rod, I asked him, well, why do we always hear about Central America? And he said it's because of these articles in the Times and Seasons, which was the newspaper, the Mormon newspaper in Nauvoo. And he said in 1842, there were some articles published that said the ruins in Central America were left by the Nephites. And so I looked at those articles, and they were signed by editors, just said ED, but it didn't have a name attached to it. And so as I looked into it, I asked Rod, well, who wrote these articles? And he said, well, everybody says it was Joseph Smith. And I thought, well, it's kind of strange that Joseph Smith would have written these articles without signing them, right?
Right.
And so I was curious who would have written these articles. And one thing led to another. As I was doing some research, I compiled about 30 pages of research. And it kept coming up with this guy named Benjamin Winchester, whom I had never heard of before. And I don't have time to get into the whole story, but I ended up writing a book. In fact, I had a copy of it. Here it is. It was called The Lost City of Zarahemla, right here.
Interesting.
And what I did in this book was explain why I thought that Benjamin Winchester was the actual author of these articles in the Times and Seasons, not Joseph Smith.
Okay, brothers and sisters, welcome back to The Last Dispensation. I am thrilled, okay? I really am. We had a really good by the way, this is Jonathan Neville, or Neville.
Yeah, Neville.
Some people pronounce their last, that's spelled that way, Neville, but Neville.
Yeah.
We had a very good conversation. We have a mutual friend. Well, a mutual acquaintance that kind of introduced me to you. And then we got on the phone and we couldn't stop talking because, folks, this, I don't know how to describe you, Jonathan. I really don't. I don't know where you came from because you are not a scholar, right?
Right.
But you are. You're what we, like all of us, you're a quasi or a neo-scholar. Maybe even a neo-apologist, would you say?
Well, I would say I'm not a scholar in the sense of I don't have a theology degree or a PhD in Hebrew or any of that kind of stuff.
Right. So can you give us a little bit of information about Jonathan or Brother Neville?
Sure. So right now I live in Oregon with my wife. I live on the Oregon coast. I've been, I've had quite a diverse career. I guess the way to start is when I went to BYU, I majored in agricultural economics. And then I went to law school. And while I was in law school, I got a master's degree in agribusiness, which is really an MBA with a focus on agricultural businesses. From there, my first job was as the law clerk for the Chief Justice of the New Mexico Supreme Court. Then I was in the military, in the Air Force for 5 years as a JAG officer. And then I was in private business as a in-house counsel for the most part. I also started several different companies. I had a computer animation company that we did projects all around the world, which is one of the reasons that I've been to over 100 countries, and I've lived in China and Africa. I've lived in Europe for 8 years total.
Now, was that before you were married? Was that when you were young?
Before and after, both.
Okay.
When I was a kid, we lived in Germany, and I lived in the Philippines as a kid. And then as an adult, I went on a mission to France, to Paris, France.
Nice.
So I was there for 2 years for that, of course.
That's a hard language out of all the Latin languages I've heard, that's the most complicated.
Yeah, I suppose it could be. I don't know Italian very well. I kind of know Spanish, but I can't speak it because I have such a bad French accent. But so I still speak French a lot when we go to Europe and things. So, and German. But my wife and I have lived in China and Africa and in Utah actually, and now we live in Oregon. So,
you don't live close to Portland, do you?
No, we're about a 3-hour drive from Portland.
Is it still kind of chaotic there a little bit?
In Portland, yeah, it's hard. Yeah, I mean, we see the news like everybody else. We really don't go through there much. it turns out we drove through there a few days ago on our way to Olympia, but we don't see as many tent cities as there were a couple of years ago.
Right.
But yeah, it's pretty awful in some areas of Portland.
Okay. Well, you've obviously have life experiences, and you are also a published author. You have how many books do you have published at this time?
Well, in the church environment, I think there's around 12. And I say around, I haven't added them up actually, because when I was in law school, I started working with one of my professors on a series of legal commentaries, and that was around 30 volumes of that. And then I've written some novels and some other things. But in terms of church books, I think about a dozen.
So that means you published more. Interesting, because when I talked to you the other night, you mentioned 12. I thought that was basically the depth of your publishing, but you have more published.
Yeah,
interesting.
Yeah. The ones I thought the other night, I thought we were talking about church stuff. That's why I mentioned.
Oh,
those.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. And that's what I'm interested in, brothers and sisters. I'm almost done with the with my website. And if you're going over there subscribing, remember it's only 99 cents a month. That's it. And you don't pay for the whole year. They take out 99 cents out of your account every month. And that's it. And you'll get the podcast, which is coming up through Spreaker. I'll be on Spotify and Apple iTunes and all those good places. That's coming very quick. I've got a newsletter and you'll be and a blog post. And anyway, you'll have all that. So the main thing is commercial free, ad free, and tyranny free. That's what I say. Because YouTube likes to censor everything nowadays. But yeah, come to the website. It's thelastdispensationpage.com. And if it looks kind of all messed up right now, it's because I'm still working on it and it's a ghost town. And don't forget, I got merch. I've got merch, Jonathan. So if you want CTR sweat hoodies that have a black CTR on it with different colors, I've got that. I've got one that says, where's Captain Moroni when you need him? And it's got a warrior on there. So go to Bonfire. All those links are on my YouTube channel. And let's see, I think that's it. If you want to become a member of YouTube, go in there, become a member. And let me see if I could. Oh, and subscribe. And then we've got Jonathan. We'll leave the links to his things, and he'll be a reoccurring guest. We've got lots to talk about.
There is a lot to talk about.
That's right. So we had conversations that were darting here and there, to and fro, and they were amazing and they were wonderful. And some of it was between you and I, because people have conversations that are private too, and not like I wouldn't want people to know those things, but they were endearing conversations that were faith promoting and just amazing. So how did you, Jonathan, get into writing books about church history? Because church history is your niche.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, it started, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, something like that. I had written a novel about the Native Americans reclaiming their land under some provisions of the treaties. And a friend of mine read it, and he said, "Oh, you need to meet this guy named Rod Meldrum." And I had never met Rod Meldrum. And so as a mutual friend, he took me to an event, and I met Rod, and I talked to Rod about it. And he said, "Oh, I'm doing a tour of Ohio. We're going to talk about the origin of the Native Americans and how it relates to the Book of Mormon. And you ought to come on that." And I thought, well, I've been all over the world, but I never had really been to Ohio much, if at all. And I thought I might as well explore the country, our own country. And so I went on this tour with Rod, and with Wayne May was the other tour guide. And it was fascinating to me just to see all these artifacts in the museums right in Ohio that relate to the Book of Mormon, at least according to what Rod and Wayne were saying. And I said, well, this all makes so much sense. Why do we always hear about Central America? And I should preface this by saying, when I was at BYU, I was a total fan of the Farms people.
Yeah.
Jack Welch, Dan Peterson, John Sorensen, those guys. I had a class from John Sorensen. I actually went to Central America a couple of times and to see the ruins and so on. And I was pretty convinced because I didn't know any better. And then after I went on this tour with Rod, I asked him, well, why do we always hear about Central America? And he said it's because of these articles in the Times and Seasons, which was the newspaper, the Mormon newspaper in Nauvoo. And he said in 1842, there were some articles published that said the ruins in Central America were left by the Nephites. And so I looked at those articles and they were signed by editor, just said ED, but it didn't have a name attached to it. And so as I looked into it, I asked Rod, well, who wrote these articles? And he said, well, everybody says it was Joseph Smith. And I thought, well, it's kind of strange that Joseph Smith would have written these articles without signing them, right?
Right.
So I was curious who would have written these articles. And one thing led to another. As I was doing some research, I compiled about 30 pages of research. And I kept coming up with this guy named Benjamin Winchester, whom I had never heard of before. And I don't have time to get into the whole story, but I ended up writing a book. In fact, I had a copy of it. Here it is. It was called The Lost City of Zarahemla, right here.
Interesting.
And what I did in this book was explain why I thought that Benjamin Winchester was the actual author of these articles in the Times and Seasons, not Joseph Smith. And so after I published that article, there's a whole background to it, how I took my findings to some of the LDS scholars, thinking they would be excited to have a new approach to all this. And instead, it was just the opposite. They started fighting me. One of them, I won't mention names, but one of them published 3 articles in the Interpreter about how stupid I was and wrong and all this. I thought, okay, whatever, What had happened is I had met with some general authorities that had worked in the history department and told them about this. And they said, this is really phenomenal. You need to get this out as an alternative perspective. And so we ended up publishing the book. I had some discussion with the Deseret Book, but they said it would take a year and a half or so to go through correlation and all that. So instead, we just published it with Digital Legend, which is Boyd Tuttle's company. And so after the book came out, and they gave me some criticism, which was helpful, and I ended up doing a second edition of this book to accommodate all their input, but it only reinforced my point. It didn't undo it.
Well, what was your point about Zarahemla? What's the whole scenario there?
Yeah. So in DNC 125 said that by revelation that they should name the city that they were going to build across the river from Nauvoo, they should put the name of Zarahemla on it.
Okay.
And so some people think that means that was the ancient Zarahemla and not the one down in Central America somewhere.
Okay.
And so the subtitle of this book says, From Iowa to Guatemala and Back Again. And the idea is that in the 1830s and 40s, people knew that city to be built across from Nauvoo was going to be named Zarahemla. But then there was an article in the Times and Seasons that said Zarahemla was in a town called Corregula, I think it is, down in Guatemala, which was a disconnect. And so, and now I don't think any scholars today believe that what the Times and Seasons article says about Zarahemla in Central America, because it doesn't fit any of the geographies. Right. So it's just pure speculation. So I started thinking, well, if Joseph Smith did not write these articles, who did? And it turned out to be Benjamin Winchester, probably with the assistance of William Smith and possibly W.W. Phelps.
Was Benjamin general authority? Was he an apostle? Or
no? Okay. I'll give you a little background on Benjamin Winchester.
Okay.
He was a very fervent missionary. In fact, he was a close friend of Joseph Smith's. When Joseph went out to Washington, D.C. to meet with the officials out there and the president, he stayed with Benjamin Winchester for about a month. In fact, they shared the same bed. Back then people only had one bed in the house and everybody kind of slept in it. But
right.
So he was real close to Joseph Smith. They corresponded with each other. On Zion's camp, he was the youngest adult. I think he was 16 years old. He and his father went on Zion's camp, and they stayed in Missouri with a few others to build bricks and build a house for a guy to raise money for the saints. But when he returned to Kirtland, they made him one of the first 70s. And so he was a missionary. He was based in Philadelphia, and he published a newspaper out there called the Gospel Reflector. For about 6 months, he
Hmm.
published it. Plus, he was the branch president. This was before they had bishops, so he was the head of the congregation there in Philadelphia. And they called him the branch president. But he was always getting in trouble. And one of the famous quotes was Wilford Woodruff was in a meeting in Nauvoo when Benjamin Winchester moved out to Nauvoo. And he said Joseph chastised him worse than he'd ever heard anybody be chastised before. And so he was a real troublemaker. But anyway, the point is that he was a fervent missionary. He published this newspaper, and he sent articles out to the Times and Seasons, which they published anonymously. They were Winchester's articles, but they published them without his name on them, and on various topics. I have them all compiled in this book. So you can see he also wrote the first concordance of the scriptures for Latter-day Saints, where he had the topics of all the scriptures, like, faith, angels, whatever. And he made a concordance. He was the first one.
Okay.
He wrote an influential book called The History of the Priesthood. And so he was a prolific author, as well as kind of a spokesperson for the church back there in Philadelphia. But when he heard that Don Carlos died, who was Joseph's brother and had been the editor of the Times and Seasons, he wrote a letter to Joseph and basically offered to take Don Carlos's place. So he moved out to Nauvoo, and he started working at the Times and Seasons in the fall of 1841. And he worked there for just a few months. And by January, apparently the Quorum of the 12 was so upset with what he was doing, and it's unclear what, but they fired him, kicked him out of Nauvoo. He went back to Philadelphia. But what people didn't realize is that he and William Smith continued a correspondence and a relationship. And William Smith at the time was the publisher of a newspaper called The Wasp in Nauvoo, which was published on the same printing press and in the same printing office as the Times and Seasons. And The Wasp was intended as a local paper, whereas the Times and Seasons was supposed to be for the entire church.
Mm-hmm.
And yet the two newspapers had articles in common and so on. And so I surmised that, well, what if William Smith was the actual editor of the Times and Seasons, because he was editing the Wasp, and he was getting these articles, content, let's say, from Benjamin Winchester and publishing it under just the name editor instead of under the name Joseph Smith.
Right.
And that's what I concluded. So, and I have all kinds of evidence of that based on later on, William Smith became the editor of a newspaper in New York called The Prophet. And he asked Benjamin Winchester to submit articles for him out there too. So that it all fit together. Well, when I published this book, I had reams of information still on the cutting floor, because this book is about 360 pages, and my editor doesn't like to do books that are longer than 350 pages. In fact, he prefers 300, short. So I said, okay, I'll just leave all that stuff out. So when these guys criticized me in the Interpreter magazine, I figured, okay, I'll publish the rest of the research. So I published 2 additional volumes about all this to give it much more detail.
Well, when you say Interpreter magazine, that pretty much narrows it down right there. I'm joking.
Well, yeah, I like to talk about the Interpreter because, I think even with ChatGPT, if you ask ChatGPT to give you the most ridiculous, offensive, sacrilegious title for a journal by academics, it would be the Interpreter, because they're usurping what the role of the prophets is, which is to interpret.
Right.
I mean, it's unbelievable that they would do that. But anyway, that's a whole nother podcast we could talk about.
Yeah. Well,
but anyway,
no, go ahead.
Well, just to finish. So once I got through all this with the newspaper and the Times and Seasons, the reason that's significant is the whole Mesoamerican theory is based on those Times and Seasons articles. And they assume that Joseph Smith wrote them. In fact, portions of them even appear in Teachings of the Prophet Joseph Smith. So we've all accepted all along that Joseph wrote those.
And your hypothesis is that he didn't.
Right. He didn't. He not only did he not do it, he didn't have any. He didn't write them.
And that it was Don Carlos and Benjamin.
Well, Don Carlos had died.
I mean, I'm sorry.
William Smith
and Benjamin.
And Benjamin Winchester.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting.
Yeah, it's pretty cool because once you really, I mean, there's so many disconnects in the times and
So
seasons.
where would that put Zarahemla again, according to your, okay.
Across the river from Nauvoo.
Right. Okay. Okay.
Yeah. They had plans to build a temple.
Okay, so brothers and sisters, so a lot of people are probably just kind of going, what's he talking about?
Yeah,
all right.
Exactly.
Don't worry, we're going to get to some nitty gritty here, but that was nitty gritty because people are like, well, what's his point? The point is that you are not a Mesoamerican geography believer in the Book of Mormon, right?
Right. Yeah.
You are a believer in the Heartland theory, or within that area.
Yeah, you should say I'm a convert to the Heartland theory because I accepted the Mesoamerican thing for decades.
Right.
You know, in fact, when John Sorensen, he did a book called An Ancient American Setting for the Book of Mormon back in, I don't remember, 1990 roughly. And when he sent that out, no, it's 1980, I think, or 1983, somewhere in there, because he sent out a preliminary manuscript of that for peer review. And I was living in Santa Fe, New Mexico at the time, and there was an archaeologist in our ward who John sent it to for a peer review. And the guy knew that I was interested in all this stuff, and so he gave me a copy. So I have a copy of that preliminary manuscript.
Mm-hmm.
And I was all in. I was convinced. I thought John Sorensen had nailed it, you know. And I can see in retrospect, I see why I reached that conclusion because I didn't know any better. I didn't know what the history of the church was. And I didn't realize how powerful the problem of confirmation bias is. So in other words, once these guys believed that Joseph Smith wrote the articles in the Times and Seasons, which meant that the Nephites lived in Central America, under that scenario, Cumorah in New York was too far away to be Cumorah. In fact, John Sorensen wrote in his book that it's a witless sci-fi movie to think that Cumorah's in New York. And so, I just bought the whole thing, hook, line, and sinker, and believed the Central American thing made sense.
Right.
But then once I looked into the church history and the origin of these articles, I thought, wait a minute, if Joseph didn't write these, then there's no reason to even be looking in Central America.
So it's interesting because you talk about confirmation bias. I mean, a lot of people's preconceived ideas, are because of the way that they were brought up and the things that they learned as a child. And when you hear something over and over again, you start to believe it. Like people going to the moon. I'm just joking. But I'm not joking. No,
I know. I've heard both sides of that one too.
Yeah. I just thought I'd throw that in there. But so it's interesting because, well, first of all, where do you can you still find this book? Is it in print? Is this, how old, when did you publish the one about Zarahemla? Yeah. This
one?
Yes.
That's a good question. I'll look it up.
Is that paperback and hardback?
No, it's on Kindle and paperback.
Okay.
2015 was the original one. And then I think in 2016 was the second edition, which has a lot of improvements in it. And the reason I'm asking you is how long have you believed that or were converted, there we go, to the idea of a different, of a non-Mesoamerica Book of Mormon geography? Well, it was about the time I published this book, because what changed my mind about it was really two things. One was realizing that Joseph Smith never wrote those articles in the first place. And two was actually going to Ohio and going to the museums and seeing the head plates and the arm plates and the breastplates and the swords, everything the Book of Mormon describes. Interesting. Which I had no idea existed in North America. Right. Well, I was joking with, I had a conversation with Rod Meldrum like a week ago. We talked for about as long as you and I talked. Yeah. And I said, well, you know what? If I go, I don't have, and folks, I don't have a stance on that either way yet. It maybe because it's not important to me right now in my life. I'm just trying to read the Book of Mormon every day, but it's exciting stuff. I think it's interesting that there are two sides to this, and it's
it's almost comical in essence.
Yeah, I agree.
That there's two groups doing that. The thing is, is I was talking to Rod and I said, but the one thing that would convert me is that the North American Native Americans would look more Israelite than people from Central America. But I digress.
So the way I view it in terms of confirmation bias, whatever you believe, even if you believe the Book of Mormon took place in Thailand, you can find geography that fits what the text says because the text is so vague. And there's three assumptions that people make that I questioned. One was the idea of the land northward and the land southward. Is that a proper noun or a relative term? And the Meso people say it's a proper noun. I say it's a relative term because if you live in California, right?
Right.
So for me, California is the land southward because I live in Oregon.
Right.
But if I was in Mexico, California
it would be the land northward.
So it all depends on where the author or the reader or the speaker is located when he refers to the land northward or the land southward. It's not a proper noun. The other is the idea of the narrow neck of land. Everybody asks me, well, where's the narrow neck of land? And I always say it's in Ether 1020, because that's the only place it shows up in the Book of Mormon. They say, no. It's all over the Book of Mormon. I say, well, show me. And it turns out there's a place that says a small neck of land and another one that says a narrow neck, but it doesn't say of land. And so I look at those as three different terms referring to three different locations.
Very interesting. I haven't looked at it like that. So when they're mentioning narrow neck, they don't mention a narrow neck of land with water beside it on either side. Say,
the Jaredite reference was to a narrow neck of land. In Alma, it refers to a narrow neck, but it doesn't say of land. And often in ordinary usage, a narrow neck is a waterway.
Oh, okay.
So I actually went and looked at some of the writings of the founding fathers, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and all that when they described the Revolutionary War. And they talk about narrow necks of land, all the same terminology, but they're very small. It's not a whole hemispheric type of a thing like in Panama. It's a narrow neck like along the Hudson River, for example. There's several locations they talked about the narrow neck. Up in Boston, when they had the Boston Tea Party and all those events, there's a narrow neck. So when you look at it, the way usage was being done in Joseph Smith's day, it referred to a fairly small location. The third thing was I assumed that the Nephites traveled by water primarily on rivers, like every ancient people we have any record of. And when you look at it that way, then the whole Book of Mormon makes sense fitting with Cumorah, New York, Zarahemla in Iowa, and everything in between all comes together. So we don't have time to talk about all the Book of Mormon geography right here, but I wanted to make that point that everybody's theory of Book of Mormon geography is based on their assumptions of the text. It's not what the text actually says, it's their interpretation of the text. But the real clincher for me was the Hill Cumorah in New York, because Oliver Cowdery wrote a series of 8 letters, which were the first history of the church, where he talked about Moroni's visit, the restoration of the priesthood, and so on. And he talked about Cumorah in a whole essay or letter called Letter Number 7. And right in there, he said it was a fact that Cumorah was in New York, at the same hill where Joseph got the plates. And he said it was on this hill where all these things happened. And when I saw that, I thought, okay, Oliver Cowdery, at the time he was the assistant president of the church. We rely on him for his testimony of the restoration of the priesthood, the translation of the Book of Mormon, everything. So if he said it was a fact, we kind of have to accept it as a fact, I think. It's not rational to reject that and accept everything else he said.
I understand what you're saying, yeah.
So if Cumorah is in New York, then these events in Central America are too far away to be Book of Mormon related. And there's lots of other reasons behind all this.
Well, and how far did Moroni travel to? That was always kind of when I would compare the both. Right. You know, I mean, that's a long way to bury some plates. I mean, or did he travel with an entourage? Maybe he did come from Mesoamerica and he traveled. Maybe his travels took him months, and he was trying to get out of there.
That's true, but except the repository of all the Nephi records was right there in New York. along with the stone box that had the abridged plates in it.
Which is another thing we're going to talk about, if not today, another time, but who knows? We'll see.
Yeah. Well, and when Moroni first visited Joseph Smith, he told him the record was written and deposited not far from his house. So if it was written not far from his house, Moroni didn't write it in Central America,
Right.
So
yeah,
anyway,
that's
yeah,
a
we
good
can
one.
talk about all that.
Yeah. So Zarahemla, what's the name of the book?
This one is The Lost City of Zarahemla.
Well, you keep saying this one. What's the other one?
Well, there's several others.
Oh, I see. It's a series. Okay.
It's the first of 3 books about Nauvoo and the times and seasons.
And we have a link for those, right?
Yeah, I can give you a link.
Okay, good.
They're all on Amazon and Deseret Book. So
speaking about gold plates, Book of Mormon geography, Moroni, what's your favorite book in the Book of Mormon?
Probably Ether.
I was just gonna say that. That means
you were going to say that because that's your favorite? Or
no, I thought you would like Ether because that's because I click with people that are into Ether. Are you a, okay, how do I say it? Are you a one that pays attention to that the Book of Mormon talks about secret combinations? Like, should we ignore that today?
No, I don't think we should ignore it.
Do we not emphasize it enough today? I don't want to get completely into that. I'm just asking.
I don't know how to say, as I mentioned in our conversation, I have to be real precise with language, right?
Right,
to the extent I can. So just the term "we" is loaded. But do we emphasize enough who's we? Okay. Well, that's true because we have our agency as members of the church to read scriptures and glean from them what we want. But go ahead. Yeah, exactly. I was going to say the brethren, every single general conference encourage us to study the scriptures, right? Right. We can all read it for ourselves. So there's no one passage that's emphasized more than any other, although apparently the most read or quoted passage is "Natural man is an enemy to God" from King Benjamin, which comes from Jonathan Edwards, but that's another topic for another day. Right. But so the way I look at it, everybody has different parts of the scriptures that appeal to them at different stages of their life, different challenges they face, and so on. So it's like you have the whole keyboard on the piano. You don't just play one key all the time. Right. And so I think it's important to understand what the Book of Ether tells us about secret combinations, but I don't think that's the overall message of the Book of Mormon. I don't think it can be. Some people tend to focus too much on that, maybe. Religious hobbies. What Brigham Young warned against religious hobbies, right? Exactly. Yeah. I agree with that. Well, why is Ether your favorite book then? Because most people will say because it talks about those things. And, Well, for me, it's because it relates to temple experience. Oh, yeah. So to me, that's the most important thing that we have in mortality, really. And I like the way it's written a lot as an author. I really like the way Moroni composed that because he summarized a lot of stuff. He interjected his own commentary and he showed how what happened then is relevant to our day. I mean, it's just a beautiful book. Yeah, it is. And it's interesting because we talk about when people are scholars are talking about authorship in the Book of Mormon, how you can see the different styles of authorship, that not one man wrote this. Ether is complete. It's interesting because Ether is completely different than the way Nephi wrote, and Nephi is completely different than Enos. And right. It's amazing. It's a beautiful work. So I was just curious about that. So we're kind of doing this little smorgasbord conversation here. But I'll tell you what, folks, that I really enjoyed talking to Jonathan the other day. I didn't want to stop. And we're going to have fun. It was a fun conversation. We've got lots to talk about. There is a lot to talk about. That's right. Thank you so much, Jonathan. And you take care. Thanks for having me.